Hi, my name is Dave Pryor. Welcome to Capturing and Tracking Risk, the secret to keeping management from helping your team. What I'm going to go through in this presentation are a couple different techniques you can use to understand what risk you're facing on different types of projects, a couple techniques that are very commonly used on the Agile side, and some traditional practices as well. When I get to the traditional practices at the end of the session, or in the latter half of the session, those are things that come out of traditional project management, stuff I learned when I was preparing for the PMP exam. And they're things that I find very, very helpful on traditional projects as well as on Agile projects. So I hope that, regardless of how you're approaching your work, that this will provide you with some valuable tools that you can explore further and start to try to implement on your projects. Before I get into the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So again, Dave Pryor. I've been working in project management for a really long time. I got started out doing web development a long time ago. When I started to learn about actual kind of formalized project management and became a PMP, I focused on that for a really long time. I used to teach PMP certification. I have a master's degree in project management, so I'm pretty deep with that stuff. But eventually I found my way into Agile. And right now I work for Leading Agile, which is an Agile transformation or Agile consulting company. And my role there is I'm a CST, a certified Scrum trainer. So I spend most of my time teaching certified Scrum Master and certified Scrum Product Owner courses. And the focus of those classes is really on trying to help people that are project managers find their way into Agile. It's really hard to let go of a lot of the stuff that you're taught if you came up from a waterfall background. I also do a lot of podcasting. You can find the podcast on Leading Agile or on projectmanagement.com, or you can just go into iTunes and search for either Leading Agile or Drunken PM Radio, which is what the podcast is called that shows up on projectmanagement.com. All the podcasts are focused on people that are trying to make the transition from waterfall over to Agile, or there's lots of interviews with different thought leaders in the Agile space as well. And I do a lot of questions from students in class. So there's a lot of good information there. I would encourage you to check it out. And if you want to get in touch with me after the presentation, you're welcome to do that. I mean, like I said a moment ago, the focus of my work is helping people coming from the traditional side of the house get over to Agile. I had a really hard time with that, and I want to do anything I can to help anybody else who's trying to make the switch. I'm very excited to be part of the digital PM community, and I've been excited to be able to speak at a number of the conferences. If you're working in digital project management and you found some great techniques or ways to apply Agile to what you're doing, I would love to hear from you, because it's something I'm really trying to kind of get my head around, how to apply a lot of the stuff like Scrum in a digital organization. A lot of places have trouble with that. Got my contact info right on the screen. All the podcasts I do show up on my blog, so if you want to just have one place to go and find that, it's right there for you. And that's it. So, on to the presentation. I want to start out by talking about what risk actually is, because it's something that a lot of people get confused in terms of understanding what risk is and what things they need to worry about. So, if you want to go with a really strict definition, this comes from SEI. The way that they define risk is it's the possibility of suffering loss. And for it to exist, you've got to have the potential for loss, uncertainty about whether or not the thing's actually going to happen. And then you've got to come up with some kind of decision about how you're going to cope with this. What are you going to do about the risk? Are you going to try to deal with it, or are you just going to accept that it's there? The thing that's important to remember is that risks and issues are not the same thing. So a risk is something that might happen. An issue is something that has happened. So we might get caught in the rain without an umbrella, or we've been caught in the rain and now we're soaking wet because we did not bring an umbrella. The second one is an issue. It's something you're already having to deal with. A risk is something that might happen in the future. Whether you're doing traditional work or you're doing Agile, there's lots of different ways you can cope with risk, or lots of ways you can try to identify it and figure out how to deal with it. The second half of this presentation is going to focus on a more traditional waterfall practice for risk, and that is a risk register and risk management meetings. I'm going to start out just by touching on some of the ways that Agile addresses risk. They're a little more lightweight. Some of you are probably already doing these things in practice, but I just want to go through them to make sure that there's some clarity on this stuff as well. So if we're talking about how people deal with risk in an Agile environment, two really common ways of addressing this are estimation, if you're using story points, and there's a way you can use risk as a prioritization technique as well. Before I talk about those, I just want to kind of mention the fact that in In Agile, if you're doing something like Scrum, a lot of people consider that to be by itself just a way of coping with risk. Rather than doing a long-term project that's going to take months before you get feedback from a customer, if you're breaking your work down into smaller pieces and you're delivering stuff in an iterative fashion and constantly looking for feedback, that inspect and adapt loop is something that's going to help you reduce risk as you move through the life of the project. So by its very nature, Agile is a way of coping with risk. But what we're going to talk about in the presentation are estimation with story points and then prioritization. One thing that I want to address right out of the gate with story point estimation is that it's not time. A lot of people misconstrue that for some reason. There's nothing in Agile that says you can't estimate work in time, and if you want to do that, that's totally fine. When I'm working on projects, when we get down to the task level, I always estimate those in time. But story points is a different way of looking at work, and what you're trying to do is use a relative way of comparing work, like how big is this thing compared to the other thing. And when we talk about story points, that's meant to be a mix of risk, complexity, and effort, all three things together. So you could have two things that are the same size for completely different reasons. It's meant to be kind of a rough way of guessing at the thing. And that's why if you're taking something like a user story, you can size that with story points, and then when you break it down into tasks, you can estimate those tasks in hours. And that gives you two different ways of looking at the work to try to make sure that your team is not overcommitting. When we're sizing work in Agile, two common practices with that are poker planning or affinity estimation. And if you're doing t-shirt sizing, that's affinity estimation, where you're just kind of grouping things into categories of small, medium, and large. If you're doing poker planning, you're assigning values, usually using a scale like Fibonacci or something like that, where you've got these numbers that grow in a certain order of magnitude. And that's how you go about doing that. But it's always comparing something back to an original thing. So if you're doing relative sizing, your team's going to have to pick a unit of measure, something that's small that they understand, and they can assign that a number and then compare that to other things. So the example I have on the slide, if your team is going to make a plate of scrambled eggs, and they say, well, we all know how to make scrambled eggs, it's a pretty simple thing to do, let's call that a 1. And then another thing you might want to do is prepare fugu. Fugu is a type of sushi that can actually kill people. It's the pufferfish sushi. So if you don't have anybody on your team who's a trained sushi chef who's been certified as somebody who's allowed to make fugu, that might present a lot of risk and a lot of complexity, because rather than just serving somebody a plate of scrambled eggs, you might be serving them something that could actually kill them. So that would have a much larger number than, something as simple as scrambled eggs. If you want to apply this to something that's more work-related, if you've got a team that's been together for a long time and they're working with a technology they already understand, they understand the problem very well, the client understands the problem very well, the work that you're defining might be fairly low risk or low complexity, and maybe it doesn't require a ton of effort. But if you're working with a brand new team, people that don't know each other very well, they haven't moved through those stages of forming, storming, norming, and gotten to performing, they're working with technology they're not familiar with, the client may have told you what they want, but you're not really sure if the client actually understands what their problem is, that's going to increase your risk, your complexity, and your effort. So, one thing compared to the others, the more complex thing, the more risky thing is obviously going to be of a larger number. So this is one of the ways that people try to understand the size of work if you're doing work in Agile, and that's with using story points. If you're looking at your product backlog, or your product owner's looking at your product backlog, and you see something that has a really high story point value, what that might tell the team is that, this thing is really big, we don't understand it very well. In order to reduce our risk, we want to break that down into smaller pieces. When we break work down in Agile, one thing to remember is that you're always trying to go for a very thin vertical slice. So not something big and massive like how do we update all the account management stuff, but how do I change a phone number? That's something really simple that you could finish in about 2 to 3 days. It's easier to do, it's got less risk, and it'll let you get feedback quicker. And again, that feedback is one of the ways that we try to reduce risk. Another way that a lot of Agile teams try to address risk is through prioritization. So this picture on the screen is an example that I have from class of an exercise I do where teams have to try to prioritize work based on risk. And what you're doing with something like this is trying to define things in terms of risk and value, and you'd place them into one of these quadrants. So you've got things that are low risk and high value. That's usually the stuff that you want to do first. You've got things that are high risk and high value. things that are low risk and low value, and things that are high risk and low value. The reason that you want to do the low risk, high value stuff first is because that's an easy way to get a better understanding of the problem. The team can get more accustomed to working together. You get used to working with the client. It helps you build some trust, and you can use some of that trust. It's almost like currency that you can spend when you go after the high risk, high value things. The low risk, low value stuff you would do third, and the things that are high risk and low value, you probably won't even do those things because there's not really much sense in putting yourself in harm's way for things nobody wants that much. If you're going to take a risk-based approach to prioritizing the work that you do, like let's say you've got a client who wants something and that's how you want to prioritize it because there's a lot of unknowns, the first thing that you're going to have to do is to define what kind of risks you're worried about. And the second thing you're going to have to do is define what kind of value you're concerned with. So the exercise that I do in class is about providing features for a car. And I've got half the class assessing work for James Bond and the other class assessing work for a soccer mom. And they all have the same features that could be included in the car. So for somebody like James Bond, putting an ejector seat in a car, that's a pretty simple thing to do. That's been done before. And he probably needs something like that. But for a soccer mom, putting an ejector seat in a car increases the risk a lot because she's going to have kids in the car. So the soccer mom might be worried about safety for her passengers. She might be worried about gas mileage. She might be worried about whether or not the car is fashionable, depending on where she lives. Where James Bond, it's more about survival, evading threats. He's going to want a very strong car that's very fast. He's got totally different needs. So different types of customers have a different understanding of value. And so that's one of the things you have to consider here. They also have a different understanding of risk. And if you're organizing things this way, the PO might put stuff into these quadrants, then prioritize them within the quadrant, and then still could choose to follow this kind of procedure of going through high value, low risk, the high value, high risk, to low value, low risk. Or they could choose to violate it if that made more sense to them in a given situation. But again, this type of approach to prioritizing work is kind of using Agile as a technique to reduce the risk that you're facing in terms of the project in general. There's other ways that people prioritize or that people work with risk in Agile. You can find stuff online about how to do like a risk burn down chart or keep a risk backlog, things like that. They're not as widely accepted as things like risk-based prioritization and estimating by story points, but there are other practices out there. The trick with this way of prioritizing work is that you have to figure out what kind of risk you're worried about. And there's many different kinds I'm going to go through in a moment, but you also have to decide what value actually means for that customer. And different types of customers have a different understanding of value. And that's one of the tricky things about doing this. When we talk about types of risk, there's lots of different types of risk, and there's no real rules about which types you have to use. I think you can kind of pick the ones that make the most sense to you and your customer. So there's some examples up here on the screen. Obviously, things like schedule risk, we all face that. Financial risk, like do you have the budget you need? There could be operation or procedural risk within your organization, depending on how it works. You could include things in your project that present risk to the team, like maybe they're going to get burned out, maybe you're afraid they're going to quit. There could be requirements risk, like how volatile are the requirements? Are they very clearly understood? Technical, functional, performance things, those are pretty common as well. Are we working with technology we understand or integrating with a partner we've never worked with before? Logistical risk, do we have the people that we need? If we have people and we can get all the resources assigned to the project, do they have the experience that they need? What about our customer? What's risky for our customer? Is the customer somebody that is open to a lot of risk? Like what's their temperament towards that stuff? There are going to be things also that are unavoidable, risks that exist beyond the team's or the organization's capacity. It could be a change in regulatory stuff that you might face in the future. And that's something you may not be able to do anything about. So we're going to talk about that when I get to the more traditional stuff in a few minutes. Also just general business risk. Whatever categories you decide you want to work with, the idea is that you're trying to figure out which of these are the most important to focus on. Because while you can identify a lot of type of risks and a lot of things that might go wrong, there are some things that are going to be more important for you to focus on than others. And one thing that's important to remember here is that this really shouldn't be just you as the PM doing this or you and the team doing this. You want to include stakeholders, you want to include the customer in these conversations. Part of what makes this stuff work is the transparency that's involved in having these open discussions about risk. So that's some basic stuff about how you can address risk in Agile and also different types of risk. And now I want to talk about risk registers, and that's really kind of the key to this presentation. This is something that comes out of traditional project management. So when I was studying for the PMP exam, this is stuff that I had to learn how to do. And when I first studied it, I learned it, but I didn't really use it. And I eventually started to use it on projects because they had a lot of risk, and I had clients that were really stressed out. And I found a number of reasons why it was very beneficial to do this. And it's something that I continued with my practice when I switched over to Agile and started doing Scrum. So this is a traditional project management practice that I find to be very helpful on Agile projects as well. I'm going to explain what they are, I'm going to explain how they work, and then we'll talk about why they're so important to do. So a risk register is like a backlog of risk. It's you and your team and your customer and your stakeholders sitting down and creating a list of all the things we can think of that might go wrong. And if you want to understand how deep you should go with this stuff, what I have found typically is that once you start to go down this rabbit hole, people keep identifying more and more things. And it does reach a point where you kind of realize this is too much detail. Like, it's just too weird and too wild of an edge case that this might happen. So you'll kind of find that level of what makes the most sense. But one thing you should expect if you're going to go down this path is that as you identify risk, they tend to spawn lots of other risks. And you will have to be able to decide which ones are the ones that you want to work on. So we're going to go through the actual risk register that I have now. You can download this. There's a link on the screen that you can follow if you want to download this template and modify it however you want. There's lots of ways to do risk registers. This is just the one that I use. So what you're looking at now on the screen is the risk register template that I use when I'm working on projects. This is one that I've kind of adapted from a number of different things. You're welcome to take this if you want, change it however you want. There's no real rules about how you have to do this, but it is a fairly common practice in traditional project management. I'm going to walk through it, explain how these different boxes work, and then I'm going to talk about why it's so valuable and how I use it and why I still use it on Agile projects. What you see on the screen is based on risk as it's defined in the current edition of the PMBOK, which is the 6th edition of the PMI's Guide to Project Management. One of the things about the PMBOK is that they identify positive and negative risks. So I'm not going to focus on positive risks in this presentation. I'm just dealing with negative risks. So these are threats that you face. And when we talk about identifying risks, one of the things that we have to do is figure out how we want to respond to them. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. One is you could escalate the risk. So if the risk is something that's beyond your control, you might kick it up to management or push it back to the client. There are risks that we're going to avoid. So in order to not face the possibility of this thing going wrong, we're going to completely sidestep anything that might allow it to happen. So for example, a simple non-project example, if you're out at a bar, you have a couple drinks, you're worried that you might get pulled over driving, with an impaired capacity while you're on the way home, you can avoid that by taking a cab or taking Uber. Okay? There are risks that we transfer. So if there's risk that you face, one thing a lot of organizations will do is outsource their work. So in that case, what you're doing is you're transferring the risk to another organization who might have more skill or more expertise with the thing that you're worried about. There are things that you want to mitigate. So what you're doing when you mitigate a risk is trying to come up with a plan for how you're going to cope with it or reduce the risk that you're facing. And there's risks that you just accept. There are things that we take on where we say, yes, I'm in danger there, but I'm going to take it anyway. It's worth the risk, something that I want to do. So now I'm going to go through the different boxes on the screen. So I usually, every risk gets an ID number, and that way it's an easy way for people to refer to it. We'll capture some kind of description. So this example, there's a chance the project cost will exceed the amount of company we have budgeted for the work. It's important to assign the risk to a person. So we want to have somebody who's going to be kind of on the hook for paying attention to this thing. So who's going to monitor the risk? You also want to identify the trigger. So how do we know that this risk has actually become an issue, right? So we might say if the expected work that we have remaining is going to cost more than $9,000 beyond the budget, what we're going to have to do is go get additional funding from management so that we don't run out of money. Here we're categorizing this as a financial risk. Now the next two columns, we've got one for probability and one for impact. And I usually use a scale of 1, 2, 3, or kind of high, medium, low. You can do this however you want, any kind of scale that you want. It's just a simple way of trying to score the thing. So I will have the team come up with a probability of how likely is it to occur, and if it does occur, what is the impact? And then to give it a score, what I usually do is multiply probability by impact. So in this example here, we've got a probability of 2 and an impact of 3, so it's got a score of 6. And when we come up with a lot of different items in the register, what we can then do is look at the PI score and figure out, okay, which is the biggest, scariest thing? And that'll help us decide which stuff we want to try to take on first if we're prioritizing it. I like to capture an understanding of what's going to happen if we don't do anything. Okay, so in this example, I'll expand the screen a little bit because I just realized that the whole table is not showing up. Okay, so if we don't do anything at all, we may not be able to secure the funding we need to complete the work. All right, and we may have to stop work before we've actually gotten to the point where we can release something to the customer. That will be bad, right? Because we're not going to get paid. So if we don't take action, this is a pretty dangerous thing. So then we have to decide, how are we going to respond? So that's where I'm going to go back up to these boxes here, and we might just accept the risk. Yeah, there's a chance that's going to happen, but we're going to take it anyway. Or in this example, we're going to mitigate it. So we want to come up with a plan that's going to help us reduce the risk, or help us reduce the possibility of not being able to finish the work. Okay, so I like to capture a response trigger. So in addition to having a trigger for knowing when the risk has actually occurred, you might incur a risk and it may not be significant enough for you to do anything about. But in this example, what I'm also trying to do is define a trigger. So we know the risk has occurred, we're at risk for going over budget, we're not going to take action until this thing has happened. So when the estimated cost for the MVP is within $5,000 of the approved total, then we're going to go out and we're going to ask for additional funding. Now I've got somebody who's responsible for identifying the risk, and in this example also someone who is responsible for initiating the response. So when it's realized that we are in that danger, this person, Jimmy Kanban, is going to have to go and try to get extra funding for the project. So there's a description here of what action we expect the person to take when they realize that the risk has occurred, and then we're going to move on to what we think will happen. So if we actually put this plan into play, what do we expect the response to be? The whole idea with this is that it gives us sort of a way of not just understanding what might go wrong, but we've got a plan. And what I found is that if you've got a really detailed risk register, it's sort of like we have all these different things that we know we can do if stuff goes wrong. And that means when they do, there's already a plan that we can put into play. What I found is that frees me up to cope with the risks that I didn't see coming. So it's really just about reducing your cognitive load and making it easier for you as a project manager to respond to the stuff that does go wrong. That's one of the important things about this. So again, you can download this template from the link that's in the slides and change it around however you need. This is a little bit more complex than a lot of people do, but this is what I found to be really helpful. So these are the different risk response types you might want to employ. Escalate, accept, avoid, transfer, or mitigate. We went through them a few minutes ago. And what I will typically do is at the beginning of the project, we'll hold an initial meeting where we try to capture all the risks that we can. But the thing about making this work is that you can't just do it in the beginning of the project. It's something that you have to do all throughout the projects. Holding a recurring risk management meeting is going to help you prepare for the things that might go wrong, but the bigger benefit is that it's going to give people a place to put their worries. So one of the things I found on projects, whether the clients are internal or external, is I have always had people who wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night because they thought of something that they're sure I didn't think about, and they're spazzed out about that, and they come running in to try to help the team. And I'm using quote fingers when I say help, because what I found is that when they want to help, it usually means they want to micromanage. And I'm always trying to prevent that from happening. The other thing I found is that when people come up with these risks, that these things that they're worried about in the middle of the night, they typically aren't the thing that they need to be worried about. It's just the thing that popped to the top of their head. And talking through that, kind of taking it off their plate, will usually let them get to the things that are the bigger risks, the stuff that they're not actually thinking about. So on the one hand, it's having this meeting on a recurring basis is giving them a place to come and place their worry in my hands so that they can let go of it and go back to their job and not worry about this anymore. Because if I've got a risk register that's that detailed and they see that thing because it's shared for everybody and I'm updating it every week, what they start to understand is that I'm worrying about their problems more than they can. And that builds trust, and it also lets them let go of that stuff. It also supports transparency. So a big thing about risk is that people fear the unknown, and they don't really want to look at the scary stuff. So what I'm always trying to do is to push that stuff out into the open so we can all talk about it and decide, okay, if this happens, what are we going to do about it? Do we have a strategy for it? And that lets us make choices at a time when we can, as opposed to waiting until the thing has gone horribly wrong and then freaking out because we don't know what to do. The reason that I consider this to be a secret weapon is because I do it over and over and over again. So if I'm on a client site, I'll usually schedule a meeting every week for an hour, and what I'll say to the customer and everybody who's involved with the project is, I will be in this room every Tuesday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. working on risk. And if there's anything about this project that has you worried or concerned or you have questions about, come to the meeting. And they know that that's a place every week where they can go and unburden themselves. So in some aspects, it's a little bit like a therapy session. But what I'm really trying to do is just alleviate their stress and their pain so that they will let the team work. We can get the stuff done. And they can also start to understand that, we've got plans. We've got ways of coping with this stuff. For this to work, you also have to keep coming back to the risks that you've identified and update the register. It's not something, as I said, that you can just do at the start of a project. To come up with a list of risks at the beginning of the project and never come back to it, it doesn't make any sense. That would be like creating a project plan at the beginning of a project and never updating it to know where you are. So it is the repetitive nature of this, the iterative nature of coming back to the risk register and the risk meeting over and over and over again so that it becomes sort of like a habit that everybody goes through, in the same way that having a daily scrum is a habit for a scrum team. So that's it. I hope this was helpful to you. I found that tracking the risk is very, very critical to enabling the team to feel safe, feel like they know what they can do if things go wrong. It's also important for the organization and the customer, like I said, in terms of giving them a place to unburden themselves. If you've got questions about this, or you want to dig into it any further, you're welcome to contact me at any time. Again, my contact information's up on the screen. And thank you for watching the presentation.